They had been raised to believe America was weak-soft from its comfort, spoiled by luxury and incapable of enduring the hardships of real war. Yet now, standing behind barbed wire in dusty prison camps scattered across the Pacific, Japanese officers stared in disbelief at the endless columns of American trucks, tanks, and aircraft moving past them. To them, this was not the nation they had imagined before Pearl Harbor. This was something else entirely, a machine of unimaginable scale, driven by industry, not ideology, by steel and fuel, not ancient codes of honor. Many of these officers had once studied in Tokyo's elite academies, steeped in the conviction that spirit sation was superior to material strength. Japan's warrior ethos, inherited from samurai tradition, had taught them that moral resolve and sacrifice would overcome any foe, no matter how wealthy or mechanized. The United States, in contrast, seemed to represent everything Japan rejected: consumerism, comfort, and a life untouched by discipline. When the war began, Japan's military elite expected that once Americans saw blood spilled, they would lose the will to fight. Instead, the opposite happened. By 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army was confronting an adversary that fought with a precision and productivity no one in Tokyo had imagined possible. The United States was producing one Liberty ship every 4 days, one B-24 bomber every hour, and nearly 50,000 tanks per year. For every Japanese aircraft destroyed, America could replace 10. Entire Pacific Islands turned into airfields overnight, built by Seabees whose speed and efficiency seemed almost unreal. In the jungles of New Guinea, American gun trucks rumbled through terrain that Japanese supply lines could barely cross. The MG-42-inspired M240 machine gun, mounted on jeeps and half-tracks, spat continuous streams of fire that overwhelmed the lightly armed Japanese infantry. The sheer abundance of war weapons, rifles, rations, medical kits, and spare parts created a rhythm of warfare Japan could not match. Captured pilots and engineers could hardly comprehend how America sustained such output. When interrogators showed them photographs of assembly lines stretching miles, filled with women riveting aircraft wings and teenagers operating presses, they fell silent. "Impossible," one naval officer muttered, shaking his head. "No nation can build so much so fast." But it was real. The industrial core of the United States had transformed into a wartime organism, Detroit building tanks instead of cars, Pittsburgh forging armor instead of bridges, and California turning from farmland to shipyard. The irony was that Japan had predicted this war, but not its shape. Tokyo's strategists had believed they could cripple the United States before its industry mobilized. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to buy time, a quick, stunning blow to demoralize a soft democracy and force it to negotiate. But Japan's war planners misunderstood the American psyche. Instead of paralyzing it, Pearl Harbor ignited a collective will that fused public anger with industrial ambition. American factories became extensions of national vengeance. When Japan lost Saipan in 1944, captured officers finally saw the full machinery of the U.S. war system up close. They were transported aboard massive troop ships, escorted by destroyers, their decks stacked with supplies. They watched as American soldiers disassembled and reassembled M60 machine guns for maintenance drills, routine, precise, almost effortless. Even the logistics of food astonished them: canned rations, refrigeration, medical supplies that seemed limitless. One prisoner reportedly said, "We believed the American soldier would collapse without luxury, but here he fights and sleeps on it." Behind these observations was a deeper realization Japan had waged a spiritual war against an industrial civilization, and spirit alone could not outpace the mathematics of mass production. The American soldier did not need to be more courageous, only sustained. And in war, endurance is a function of supply. As the prisoners looked out across the camp's tents, mess halls, repair depots, vehicles arriving hourly, they began to understand a painful truth. The war had not been lost in a single battle, nor by inferior courage. It had been lost in the foundries of Michigan, the shipyards of Seattle, the assembly lines of Ohio. Every tank that rolled from those lines, every aircraft wing riveted in Los Angeles, had already decided the outcome before bullets were even fired. And yet an even more unsettling question lingered among the captured officers. How could a nation they dismissed as indulgent have found such discipline, such unity of purpose? What hidden force had turned comfort into capacity and softness into steel? In the months following their capture, Japanese officers and engineers were quietly interviewed by American intelligence teams. The interrogations were not about secrets of weapons or tactics. They were about psychology. The United States wanted to understand how a nation that glorified sacrifice could have underestimated the industrial strength standing against it. What emerged from those conversations was a portrait of profound cultural miscalculation. For decades before the war, Japan's leadership had been guided by a deep suspicion of Western decadence. American cities, seen through the filtered lens of propaganda, appeared soft, distracted by consumer pleasures, jazz music, and individualism. Japanese war theorists like Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied in the U.S., knew this perception was dangerously wrong, but his warnings were drowned out by the louder confidence of the imperial general staff. America is a country of machines, Yamamoto once said, but machines cannot fight without the human will. Ironically, it was America's machines and the human will behind them that would bring Japan to its knees. Inside the American war machine, every detail had been designed for scalability. A rifle was not just a weapon, it was a modular product. The M1 Garand could be produced by multiple factories with interchangeable parts. The same philosophy extended to larger systems planes, tanks, even the M60 machine gun that evolved from wartime engineering programs. Each design was standardized, tested for rapid manufacture, and built from materials sourced across the continent. The result was astonishing, a seamless ecosystem of production in where steel, copper, and rubber moved from mine to factory to front line in synchronized flow. In contrast, Japan's industrial base was constrained by geography and philosophy. Its islands lacked key resources. Oil, aluminum, and rubber had to be imported. Engineers were brilliant craftsmen, but Japan's wartime industry prized perfection over speed. Every Zero fighter, for instance, was hand-fitted with extraordinary precision. But that same attention to detail slowed production to a crawl. For every 5 Zeros produced, America could churn out a squadron of Hellcats. While Japan's designers obsessed over incremental improvements, the U.S. focused on manufacturing efficiency. This difference became catastrophic by 1943. In the skies above the Pacific, Japan's dwindling pilots faced waves of replacements so vast they seemed endless. American airfields operated like factories themselves, planes landing, refueled, rearmed, and back in the air within minutes. Even maintenance was industrialized. Engineers used assembly line techniques to repair engines, swap machine guns, and load bombs. By then, Japan's logistical network was collapsing. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft, spare parts were scavenged from wrecks, entire garrisons fought with outdated or improvised weapons, while American convoys delivered fresh M240s ammunition and supplies across thousands of miles of ocean. The prisoners who had commanded such units now faced the reality of defeat not just by force of arms, but by the machinery of continuity. American war weapons never stopped arriving. The sound of engines never ceased. For men raised to believe that victory came from spirit, the realization was existential. They began to grasp that the enemy's power lay not in ideology, but in process, a relentless, self-sustaining rhythm of production. One Japanese colonel reportedly told his interrogator, You Americans fight with your factories, not your soldiers. He meant it as both criticism and respect. To him, the battlefield had expanded beyond geography. It included the assembly line, the transport ship, the oil refinery. And there, Japan had no foothold. The contrast extended even to morale. While Japan's soldiers starved on distant islands, American troops received mail from home, fresh uniforms, and cigarettes by the crate. It wasn't luxury, it was a psychological design. Every system from logistics to medical care was built to keep soldiers functional, not heroic. Japan had demanded heroism. America engineered endurance. By the end of 1944, captured Japanese engineers began drawing sketches for their American counterparts, trying to explain their own production methods. Some were stunned when they were shown photographs of U.S. shipyards turning out Liberty ships faster than Japan could build destroyers. Others stared silently at images of massive aircraft factories stretching beyond the horizon. A few asked almost naively, "Where do you find so many workers?" The answer: everywhere. Housewives, students, immigrants, farmers. America had turned its entire population into a coordinated force of production. To the prisoners, this was an alien concept. Japan's rigid hierarchy and class traditions had made such mobilization impossible. The idea that women could build aircraft or that assembly workers could alter designs on the spot violated their military logic. But for America, it was this very flexibility, this fusion of industry and democracy, that became its most powerful weapon. The deeper irony was that Japan, in trying to emulate Western militarism, had never understood Western industrialism. Its generals studied Prussian tactics and British naval codes, but ignored the modern heart of those empires, their ability to manufacture war itself. Now, sitting in the stillness of prison camps, those same officers could hear the distant hum of American transport planes crossing the skies overhead. The war was over for them, but the question was only beginning to take shape. How had the United States, a nation of comfort and commerce, found the will to mobilize every ounce of its being into the machinery of destruction? To answer that question, historians often look to one pivotal year, 1942. The Japanese had stunned the world with a string of victories across the Pacific, from the fall of Singapore to the Philippines. The empire seemed unstoppable. But behind the scenes, the United States was awakening. The shock of Pearl Harbor had triggered not panic, but transformation. Civilian industries that once made typewriters, washing machines, and automobiles began converting overnight. Ford's Willow Run plant alone would build more than 8,000 B-24 bombers. The Kaiser shipyards on the West Coast produced entire fleets of Liberty and Victory ships with almost mechanical rhythm. What struck Japanese observers most after the war was not the technology itself. It was how ordinary Americans seemed to accept total mobilization without coercion. In Japan, war had been sold as sacred duty wrapped in imperial myth. In America, it became a collective enterprise of practicality. Posters declared, "Do the job he left behind, and we can do it." Production was patriotism. When Japanese POWs later read those slogans, many couldn't comprehend how a democracy without emperor or dogma could unify so completely. The American military-industrial complex of the 1940s was not yet the bureaucratic giant it would become in the Cold War, but its structure was revolutionary. Industrial committees linked government contracts to private firms, ensuring rapid output and standardization. The system rewarded speed, not perfection. If an M60 or a Browning M1919 jammed under field conditions, engineers redesigned it within weeks. There was no obsession with legacy or prestige, only function. Meanwhile, Japanese industry suffered from what some post-war reports called craft fatalism, the belief that spiritual craftsmanship could overcome physical limits. That belief produced beauty, but not enough weapons. In interviews conducted at Camp Tracy, California, several Japanese officers admitted they had underestimated American innovation. One recalled seeing an improvised gun truck convoy in the Philippines, civilian trucks fitted with armor plating carrying M240s welded onto makeshift turrets. "We thought Americans were lazy," he said, "but lazy men do not build such machines in the middle of a jungle." Those convoys symbolized something profound, an enemy that adapted faster than doctrine allowed. Adaptation became America's silent doctrine. Each setback bred a new invention. When torpedoes failed, they were redesigned. When tanks bogged down, engineers created lighter models. The Japanese, guided by hierarchy and tradition, struggled to accept field innovation without orders. Their soldiers fought bravely, often to the last man, but bravery could not bridge the gap between individual valor and industrial logic, and by 1945, Japan's industrial map was being erased from the sky. American bombers methodically targeted steelworks, railways, and shipyards, the nation's arteries of war. For every bomb that fell, another batch of aircraft rolled off the assembly line to replace the lost ones. The empire's dream of endless expansion had become a war of attrition it could never win. Captured officers began to piece it together. The defeat was not moral failure, but mathematical inevitability. A nation producing 300,000 aircraft a year cannot be beaten by one producing 5,000. A fleet replacing a sunk carrier in months cannot be matched by an empire needing years. Even the finest samurai spirit cannot change arithmetic. And yet the revelation was not purely about numbers. Some Japanese prisoners expressed a kind of reluctant admiration for America's unity of function. "You Americans have no samurai," one said, "but every worker in your factory fights like one." That sentence would haunt post-war scholars for decades. It captured the essence of total war in the modern age. The concept of the warrior had shifted from the battlefield to the assembly line. As news of Japan's surrender spread through the camps, silence settled over many of the captured officers. They had entered the war believing the United States was a civilization in decline, a land of indulgence, unfit for sacrifice. Now they saw that comfort had concealed an enormous capacity for organization, discipline, and creativity. America had not been soft. It had been supple, able to bend without breaking, to transform leisure into labor and consumerism into coordination. That realization reshaped Japan's post-war identity. The same officers who once dismissed American industry as soulless would later help rebuild Japan's own economy using those very principles: efficiency, adaptability, and mass production. The legacy of defeat became the blueprint for resurrection. But in 1945, as the prisoners watched American cargo ships unload supplies that no longer had to be used in war, one question still burned quietly in their minds. If America's strength came not from blood, but from systems, then what truly had Japan been fighting against all along? The answer in time revealed itself not in the ruins of Hiroshima or the ashes of Tokyo, but in the silent hum of peacetime machinery. Japan, shattered and disarmed, began to rebuild under American occupation. And what its former officers saw in this process was the same engine that had defeated them, an industrial and psychological rhythm capable of turning destruction into renewal. The same factories that had once built tanks and M240s now produced automobiles and sewing machines. The very concept of war weapons had been inverted into tools of commerce. To the Japanese, this transformation was both alien and mesmerizing. In the military academies of their youth, they had been taught that victory comes through purity of spirit, through loyalty, obedience, and self-sacrifice. But the Americans had fought and won through something far more impersonal: organization. They had weaponized efficiency, and in doing so, they had proven that willpower could exist not just in the human heart, but in the structure of an entire society. The U.S. had mobilized a nation of millions without extinguishing individuality. Each citizen had become a cog in a vast system that still allowed creativity to flourish. Workers suggested improvements to machinery, engineers debated designs, factory managers revised production schedules overnight. Flexibility, once dismissed by Japanese militarists as weakness, was the very secret of America's endurance. By the early 1950s, as Japan began to rise from the ruins, its leaders quietly studied the American model. They found that the same decentralized decision-making that once baffled them in war was now the key to industrial success. Corporations adopted systems of continuous improvement, what the Americans had called efficiency, the Japanese refined into kaizen. Engineers who once drew blueprints for Zero fighters now built engines for Toyota. Naval architects who had designed warships helped Mitsubishi develop cargo freighters. The old warrior's discipline merged with the new industrial logic. In hindsight, the war between Japan and the United States had been more than a clash of nations. It had been a collision between two worldviews. Japan believed spirit could transcend matter. America believed systems could multiply it. Spirit without structure had collapsed. Structure infused with purpose had prevailed. That truth would haunt and inspire generations of both nations. For American soldiers returning home, the victory carried its own lessons. Many veterans who had operated the M60 machine gun in the jungles of the Pacific or manned gun truck convoys on island roads found themselves working in the same factories that had armed them. The arsenal of democracy became the workshop of peace. And yet the memory of the war, the sight of those defeated soldiers staring at endless convoys of American equipment, remained a silent warning. Industrial might is a double-edged weapon. In the decades that followed, the world entered a new kind of conflict, not one of battlefields, but of economies. Japan, once crippled by its over-reliance on spirit, mastered the very system that had undone it. Its products began to dominate global markets. Cameras, radios, automobiles, each bore the imprint of a philosophy born from defeat precision through process strength, through structure. It was as if the spirit of the samurai had found a new home in the machinery of peace. Historians later described the astonishment of those wartime prisoners as the first moment Japan glimpsed the true power of industrial civilization. It wasn't brute strength, nor even superior weapons. It was the ability to translate collective will into mechanical form. A B-29 bomber, an M240 machine gun, a Liberty ship, they were all extensions of the same idea that discipline, when multiplied by machinery, becomes destiny. Even now, that lesson endures. Every modern military, every global economy lives in the shadow of that paradox, that the same organizational genius that wins wars can also rebuild nations. The Japanese officers who once called America soft had witnessed not softness, but a new kind of hardness, one that did not roar or boast, but produced. As the war faded into memory, one former imperial officer interviewed decades later was asked what he thought of America after the surrender. He paused for a long time before answering. "We believed the sword was eternal," he said quietly, "but they had built 1,000 swords a day." That single line summarized the greatest transformation of the 20th century, the moment when craftsmanship met mass production, when the soul of war became the science of industry. It was not just Japan that learned this lesson. The entire world did. For in the end, it was never about who fought harder or who believed more deeply. It was about who understood that power in the modern age belongs not only to the brave, but to the organized.